There's something unsettling about the silence of a basement, especially when it feels like you're being watched from the shadows. The darkness has a weight to it, a suffocating presence that lingers in the corners, waiting for you to make a wrong move. And sometimes, what lies hidden beneath your feet is more terrifying than you can imagine. Jack had always known there was something off about the basement of the old house he'd bought. The house itself was a beautiful Victorian-style place, a bit run-down, but full of potential. But the basement had a different kind of energy. It was cold, even in the middle of summer, and no matter how many times he went down there, Jack always felt like he wasn't alone. One evening, while trying to clear out some of the old junk left behind by the previous owners, Jack stumbled across something strange. Behind a stack of wooden crates, tucked away in the farthest corner of the basement, was a small door. It was half rotted, the wood splintering, and the metal latch rusted over. But what really caught Jack's attention was the lock. It was heavy-duty, too secure for such a tiny door, as though whatever was inside needed to be kept out, or maybe something needed to be kept in. His curiosity got the better of him, and with a few sharp tugs, Jack managed to break the lock off. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway leading to an even smaller room. The smell hit him first, a musty, decaying scent that made his stomach churn. Inside the room, the walls were lined with scratch marks, as if someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. At the center of the floor was an old iron shackle, bolted to the ground, with a thick, broken chain still attached. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the implication. Someone had been imprisoned here. Shaken, Jack backed out of the room and shut the door, hoping to forget what he had just discovered. But that night, as he lay in bed, he began hearing noises from the basement. At first, it was just the sound of something moving, like soft footsteps echoing up the stairs. But soon, the noises grew louder, more insistent. There was banging as if someone, or something, was pounding on the walls from the inside. The next morning, Jack tried to convince himself it had all been in his head. Maybe it was just the house settling, or an animal trapped in the walls. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. Whatever was down there wasn't an animal. It was something much darker. Over the following days, the activity in the basement escalated. Lights flickered on and off, shadows seemed to move on their own, and cold drafts swept through the house, even though the windows were all closed. One evening, as Jack was cooking dinner, he heard a loud crash from the basement. He ran down the stairs, only to find that the crates he'd moved had been overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. And then, from the corner of the room, Jack saw it, a figure barely visible in the dim light. It was hunched over, its back to him, but he could hear its labored breathing. The figure shifted slightly, and Jack's heart nearly stopped as it turned its head toward him. Its eyes were hollow, sunken deep into its skull, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque snarl. Panicked, Jack bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. He could still hear the figure's footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the walls. Desperate, Jack called a friend, explaining what had been happening. His friend, skeptical at first, agreed to come over the next day and take a look. But that night, things took a turn for the worse. As Jack lay in bed, the air around him grew frigid. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He could hear the footsteps again, but this time they weren't coming from the basement. They were right outside his bedroom door. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the door slowly creaked open. The shadowy figure from the basement stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on him. It didn't move, but Jack could feel its malevolent presence filling the room, suffocating him with terror. The next day, Jack's friend arrived, but by then, it was too late. Jack was a shell of his former self, pale, gaunt, and haunted by the things he had seen. Together, they went back down to the basement, determined to put an end to whatever was haunting the house. As they entered the secret room, they found something new. Etched into the floor were words, scrawled in what looked like blood. "I was never meant to leave." Suddenly, the air grew icy, and the lights flickered violently. The figure appeared again, this time moving toward them with terrifying speed. Jack's friend screamed, backing up against the wall, but Jack knew there was no escape. The spirit, whatever it was, had been waiting for someone to find it, to release it from its prison. And now it was free. The walls of the basement seemed to close in on them as the spirit's anger filled the room. Jack could feel its icy breath on the back of his neck, hear its tortured whispers growing louder and more frantic. Desperate, he grabbed the broken chain from the floor and swung it wildly, hoping to fend off the spirit. But it was no use. The spirit latched onto Jack, its hollow eyes locking onto his. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the spirit's twisted face inches from his own. The next morning, Jack's friend found him lying unconscious in the basement, barely breathing. The police were called, but no one could explain what had happened. The house was sealed off, and the secret room was boarded up. But Jack never recovered. The haunting had left its mark on him, and he would never be the same again. The spirit, once imprisoned in the darkness of the basement, was now free, and Jack knew that it would never stop looking for another prisoner to take his place. There are certain things in old houses that are best left untouched. Sometimes, the walls hold secrets too dark to be revealed, secrets that don't want to be found. This is a story of one such discovery that should have never seen the light of day. It started innocently enough. The old Victorian house had been on the market for years before the Thompson family decided to buy it. The price was surprisingly low, and though the place needed some work, they were up for the challenge. It had character, history, and plenty of space for their growing family. The first few weeks were spent pulling up old carpets, replacing broken windows, and repainting faded walls. But as they began renovating the basement, they uncovered something unexpected. While knocking down a wall to create more storage space, the contractors found a hidden room sealed off by bricks and wooden beams. It wasn't in the original house plans. There had been no indication that such a room even existed. The moment the wall came down, an unsettling chill filled the air. The temperature in the basement dropped noticeably, and a musty old smell wafted out from the hidden room. Inside, they found furniture covered in dust, a bed, a dresser, and a small wooden desk. Old photographs hung on the walls, their frames tilted and cracked. But what caught everyone's attention was the collection of personal belongings scattered across the room. There were clothes hanging in the closet, shoes neatly lined up at the foot of the bed, and an old leather journal resting on the desk. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry, or maybe they never had the chance to leave. And it was that journal that held the key to the mystery. The family hesitated, but eventually curiosity won out. Mrs. Thompson, the mother, opened the journal and began reading aloud. The entries were from a woman named Evelyn Montgomery, who had lived in the house during the late 1950s. The early pages were filled with ordinary details about her life, but as Mrs. Thompson read further, the tone shifted. Evelyn wrote about strange noises coming from the basement at night, the sound of something scraping against the walls. She had started to feel watched, like someone, or something, was in the room with her, even though she was alone. There were mentions of dark shadows moving in the corners of her vision, and by the final entry, her handwriting had become frantic, almost illegible. The last entry simply read, "They're coming for me. I can hear them. I don't know if I can hide any longer." After reading those words, the Thompsons felt a deep sense of dread. Who was they, and what had happened to Evelyn? Mr. Thompson tried to brush it off as paranoia or the ramblings of a distressed mind, but the more they dug into the house's history, the darker the story became. Evelyn Montgomery had disappeared in 1958. There was no trace of her, no body, no belongings, nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The police had investigated, but found no evidence of foul play. Her case went cold, and the house changed hands several times over the years. That night, strange things began happening in the house. Mrs. Thompson woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a soft breeze, but distinct enough to make the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded desperate, as if it was pleading for help. Mr. Thompson dismissed it as a dream, but when the whispering continued the following night, he couldn't deny it anymore. The children started complaining about cold spots in the house, especially near the basement. The youngest, Emma, claimed she had seen a woman standing at the top of the basement stairs, her face hidden in shadow. Tension in the house grew. Doors began to slam on their own, lights flickered despite the new wiring, and the whispering grew louder every night. One evening, as Mrs. Thompson was folding laundry in the basement, she heard a loud crash from the hidden room. When she went to investigate, she found the furniture overturned, as if someone had thrown it across the room. But no one else had been down there. Desperate for answers, the family called in a paranormal investigator. He arrived the next day, armed with cameras and equipment meant to detect any supernatural activity. The moment he stepped into the basement, his face went pale. There was something there, he said, something angry and dangerous. It didn't want them in the house. As the investigator set up his equipment, the house seemed to come alive. The temperature plummeted and a heavy, oppressive feeling filled the air. The basement lights flickered violently, and the whispering turned into low guttural growls. The investigator captured strange anomalies on his camera, blurry figures that seemed to move through the room and cold spots that defied explanation. And then, as the investigator stood in front of the hidden room, his equipment malfunctioned. The screen went black and the lights in the basement went out. In the darkness, they all heard it, a loud, bone-chilling scream that echoed through the room. Panic set in. The family rushed upstairs, leaving the investigator behind. When they returned a few moments later with flashlights, he was gone. His equipment lay scattered on the floor, but there was no sign of him. The only clue was the journal, which had somehow moved from the desk to the middle of the room. The final pages were now smeared with fresh ink, and new words had been added. "I warned you. You should have left. Now you belong to them." Terrified, the Thompsons packed their bags and fled the house that same night. They never returned. The house was abandoned once more, and over the years it fell into disrepair. But the whispers still echo through the basement, and the room remains sealed, holding on to its secrets, waiting for the next family to unlock the horrors hidden within. The legend of the hidden room has become a warning. Some say Evelyn's spirit still roams the house, trapped and searching for a way out. Others believe that the dangerous force she wrote about has claimed the basement as its own. And anyone who dares to uncover the room's secrets will be next in line to disappear. Evelyn's journal remains in the house, untouched, but the words she left behind still haunt those brave enough to read them. Sometimes it's better not to know the truth, because once you open that door, there's no going back. In 1949, a tragedy struck that left scars far deeper than the foundation of any house. A fire raged through a small, modest home nestled in the quiet outskirts of town. It was a fire that no one expected and one that no one could escape. The family that lived there, the Thompsons, perished in the blaze. Their home was reduced to ashes, and their screams still seemed to echo in the town long after the smoke cleared. Years passed, and the land was eventually bought, cleared, and rebuilt. But the town never forgot. Whispers of that terrible night spread from neighbor to neighbor, and some swore they could still hear the faint cries of the Thompsons if the wind blew just right. Still, life moves on, and another family would soon call this land their home. In the winter of 1985, the Montgomery family moved into the newly built house. Patrick and Amelia Montgomery were a couple looking for a fresh start with their son Justin. The house had been a bargain. Too good to pass up, even though they had heard the stories about the land it was built on. They laughed off the idea of ghosts, thinking it was just a way for the townspeople to scare them off. But from the moment they moved in, something felt wrong. The air in the house seemed colder than it should have been, even with the heating on full blast. And no matter how many lights they installed, the basement always remained shrouded in darkness, a thick, oppressive gloom that clung to every corner. It was the basement that bothered them the most. Whenever Patrick went down there to check on the furnace or fetch something from storage, he felt as though he was being watched. At first, he brushed it off as just his imagination. But as the days turned into weeks, the feeling grew stronger. And he wasn't the only one. Amelia began to hear whispers when she was in the kitchen, a faint, raspy sound that drifted up through the floorboards. She would check the basement, thinking maybe the furnace was acting up, but it was always quiet when she reached the bottom of the stairs. Justin, too, began having nightmares. He would wake up screaming about a fire, about people trapped, clawing at the walls, trying to escape. The nights grew longer and the house colder. Winter had come early, and the frost seemed to seep into the walls. One night, Patrick decided to check the basement furnace one more time, convinced something was wrong with it. He descended the creaky steps, his flashlight cutting through the dense shadows. As he neared the bottom, his breath caught in his throat. The air felt thick, heavy, and frigid. And then he saw it, scorch marks. The walls, the ceiling, and even the floor had faint black streaks, like the remnants of an old fire. He hadn't noticed them before, but now they were unmistakable. Panic started to rise in his chest. He hurried back upstairs, his heart pounding, but he didn't tell Amelia what he had seen. Not yet. The next day, things escalated. Amelia was in the kitchen when she heard the whispers again. But this time, they weren't just faint murmurs. They were loud, desperate cries for help. She ran to the basement door, flinging it open, and was hit by an overwhelming smell of smoke. She coughed, gasping for air, but there was no fire in sight. Just the heavy, suffocating stench of burning wood. Justin refused to go down to the basement. He had started drawing pictures of fire, of people with their hands pressed against the windows, their faces twisted in agony. He drew shadows, two dark shapes that stood in the background watching. The Montgomerys were no longer in control of their home. Something else had taken over. One evening, as the family sat down to dinner, the temperature dropped drastically. It was freezing, even though the furnace was still running. The lights flickered, and the air became thick with the smell of smoke once more. Patrick grabbed a flashlight and stormed down to the basement. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, on the far wall of the basement, was a door he had never noticed before. It was old, made of warped wood, and it was slightly ajar. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. Pushing it open, he shone the flashlight into the small room beyond. The room was charred. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all blackened with soot, and in the center of the room there were claw marks. Deep, frantic scratches gouged into the wood, as if someone had been trapped inside, desperately trying to escape. Patrick stumbled back, his heart racing. He slammed the door shut and ran back upstairs, but the house seemed different now. The cold was unbearable, and the whispers, the cries for help, were louder than ever. That night, as the family huddled together in the living room, the temperature plummeted. The windows frosted over, and a heavy fog rolled in from the basement stairs. Patrick grabbed Amelia and Justin, urging them to leave the house. But before they could reach the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The whispers turned into screams. The sound of fire crackling filled the air, but there were no flames. Just heat, smoke, and the overwhelming sense of terror. The Montgomerys ran from room to room, trying to escape, but every door they opened led back to the basement. The house had trapped them. It was then that Patrick realized they weren't alone. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, twisted, blackened figures that flickered in and out of the darkness. He could hear their voices now. They were the Thompsons, the family that had perished in the fire, and they were not happy. Patrick screamed for help, but the walls seemed to close in on him. The shadows swirled around them, their screams growing louder, more desperate. They were reliving their last moments over and over again, and they were pulling the Montgomerys into their nightmare. In the end, it was Amelia who found the answer. She grabbed Justin and ran to the old door in the basement. With trembling hands, she opened it. The room was still charred, still covered in soot. But there on the floor she saw it. An old rusted key. With no other option, she grabbed the key and inserted it into the lock of the door. The moment she turned it, the house fell silent. The cold lifted, the smoke cleared, and the shadows vanished. The Montgomerys fled the house that night, never looking back. The house still stands, abandoned and frozen in time. But those who pass by on cold winter nights say they can still hear the whispers. The desperate cries of the family trapped in the basement, reliving the horror of their last moments. And the Montgomerys, they never spoke of that night again. But the memories of the fire, the screams, and the shadows will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts or your own personal scary stories in the comments below. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, what you don't see can be the scariest of all.